Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Talk with CastleHill. Today I'm joined by Joe Santangelo and Justin Riehl, my colleagues. We're going to be talking about some things that have actually come out in the last year or so around different evaluations from a corporate compliance perspective. So specifically, we're going to talk about the U.S. Department of Justice, the evaluation of corporate compliance programs notice back from June in 2020. And so the reason why we thought it was going to be interesting to talk about is just how it impacts different risk areas, specifically for today's conversation around third-party risk management and going from there. And so, the purpose of this letter or this notice is to assist prosecutors, I'm going to read it out, in making informed decisions as to whether and to what extent the corporation's compliance program was effective at the time of the offense and is effective at the time of a charging decision or resolution for purposes of determining the appropriate one, form of any resolution or prosecution, 2, monetary penalty, always the fun part, or 3, if any compliance obligations contained in any criminal resolution, such as monitoring or reporting obligations. So it's pretty, classic Department of Justice type of activity in terms of there's very serious repercussions if you're not able to substantially meet the requirements that are laid out. Or are not able to demonstrate that you're actively engaged from a program perspective into doing some of these activities. So Justin, if it's all right, as our head of third-party risk management in our practice, why don't you give me a little bit of sense of what this means in that section E of the document around third-party management?
So for third-party management, what they're really saying is if a prosecutor is going to move into an organization, one of the core tenets of their exploration is making sure that the company has a good sense of third-party risks, that they have the appropriate controls in place, the appropriate processes, and that they can help guide that prosecutor through the process of evaluating where potential exposure was and how that exposure was handled in the organization. So where it talks about things such as understanding, I think it says, the qualifications and the associations of third-party partners and ensuring that those types of associations aren't commonly used to conceal misconduct. How do you do that? What are the systems that you have in place? What are the controls that you have in place? Are you doing OFAC checks or Department of State checks? And are you using news aggregators, that type of thing? So they want to see the completeness, or they want the prosecutors to be aware of what a complete third-party risk management process looks like, and vendor management as well.
This is interesting in light of the fact that the FTC has also come out recently and said that vendor oversight is a key component of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley safeguards rule. And as part of that, they talk about, continuous oversight of vendors, not just when you're onboarding them, but to have it continuously. And I believe the DOJ also talks about monitoring your third-party relationships over the lifespan of the relationship. So not when you just come in, monitoring them on an ongoing basis, reassessing risks, and ensuring that you have the proper resources to do that. That to me sounds like it's going to be difficult for a number of firms.
In term, you mean it's going to be difficult for them to prove that out to the prosecutors? Is that what we're saying?
Well, just to keep up that effort of continually monitoring their third parties, reassessing the risks, adjusting the monitoring to be commensurate with the type of risk that you now think this vendor is.
Yeah, I think the good news is most organizations, particularly the ones with this type of guidance, like, right, where you have a lot of, financial services would just be a good example of that. A lot of those organizations already have most of the core components of third-party risk management and vendor management already integrated into their organizations. So the leap to go from what may be in some organizations a check-the-box exercise to something that's a little bit more comprehensive and integrated, I don't think that's too big of a valley to cross in this case. But it does require that the organization, put in place real controls and real integration, and not just a semblance of that. I think that a lot of organizations are actually pretty close to where they need to be. But in order to satisfy queries from prosecutors, for example, they're probably going to have to do it better at some point and improve their capabilities. And you will see that. I mean, that's coming out from the FTC, CFPB, DOJ. You're going to start seeing some vendor-related regulations coming out from at the state level from different departments of state, for example. So that's all part of it. And we've seen that previously in things like the New York State statutes and the California statute. So everybody's always talking about vendor risk now and making sure that it's not overlooked maybe the way it was, 15 or 20 years ago. Now they see that as a real inroad into understanding around an organization and how it operates and what controls it.
A good bellwether for what they're doing overall, relative to a compliance program and how effective they are. So, but I think Joe, as you pointed out, right, this is the maintenance of the program, right? Not just standing it up the one time or doing it once a year, maintaining the program, and ensuring those consistent activities are happening. I mean, these are not new regulations overall, right? GLBA is 1990s. It's those sort of things. This is not new from that perspective. And I think, Justin, to your point, right, we've been talking about vendor risk for a while as being something which has been in the crosshairs of different regulatory bodies to come after, or auditors, for prosecutors, other things like that, because it is a process that people should be able to do well. A lot of folks have those policies out there, but so what are they missing? Right? What do you guys think is missing for those folks? What is the missing secret sauce that would get them, not have them have that fine or the regulatory sanction or any of those things?
Yeah, I think historically companies have probably been pretty good at collecting information and reviewing information. I don't know that organizations have been particularly effective until recently in actually doing something with the information after they've collected it. They haven't been necessarily using it in strategic decision making or to augment more enterprise level concerns around risk. I think this document or this guidance is letting them know that, in fact, this is something that they're going to have to do better going forward. That's the big piece. You're collecting all of this information. What are you doing with it? What does the end-to-end look like? If you find something that is unfavorable, if you get some bad news about a vendor, for example, what are the controls that you put in place to make sure that you don't actually accidentally onboard that vendor or do so in the future? That type of thing. So again, great at collecting data, great at reviewing that information, not so great at tying it into the overall enterprise risk management strategy. And I think that's where they're going to have to do better going forward.
And I think one of the things is where does it end? Because if you look at organizations, and even recently the Monetary Authority of Singapore came out with some guidelines that organizations can't just be focused on their own internal risks, and that's what we're talking about here. Things that are outside of their organization. They need to think more about the risks of the organizations that they deal with, that provide them with services. And where does that end? Because if you know that, okay, your third party, you think they're fine, they're doing great, they passed your assessment, they've been passing it for the last few years, but you know what? One of their vendor or several of their vendors is a little suspect. So that is a place where I'm seeing that organizations are not as let's say up to speed in terms of looking at a little bit further past their initial vendor.
Yeah, so one of those areas is it's not reasonable to expect an organization to look at a service provider to the nth degree of separation, right? So, you can look pretty easily at the first degree, second degree, sometimes even the third degree relationships. It's a lot easier for technology than it is something like consulting or more of a business service. But they have those capabilities. I think where it becomes reasonable for organizations to do better than that is in their ongoing monitoring. So this is where things, again, like OFAC checks, just understanding what the relationships are, maybe not understanding exactly what all the specific details are, but knowing who the individuals and organizations are that they're dealing with, and making sure that that's part of the ongoing monitoring, and making sure that you're looking a little further down into the relationships to be able to glean that information. If an organization, what was my example previously was a financial services organization, it's pretty easy to go to a third party or even a fourth party. But at the point where you start looking at fifth, sixth, and seventh parties, you really don't have a contractual relationship that you're basing your queries on. And so you have to kind of do it from the outside. And that's one of those areas again. And, there's a lot of data providers out there now that do that, where you didn't have that, you didn't have those resources previously. This is something now that Dun & Bradstreet is going to do with you. Dow Jones has some excellent business products out there that show the relationships between different organizations all across the world. Remember, just because you're doing, or just because you have a relationship here, domestically, it doesn't mean that relationship doesn't extend internationally. So it's those data service providers combined with ongoing monitoring that's going to get you sort of that next level of where you need to be in terms of, I don't know where it ends, Joe, honestly. I mean, it could go, it's a big web out there, but there are certainly opportunities to demonstrate to a prosecutor in this case that you have put your best foot forward. And I think that's important. So understanding the process, you see inherent risk based on company type and relationship type is almost always the first step these days. Using that information to understand what the appropriate tier and the appropriate level of due diligence is against a particular vendor, for example, or whether or not upfront that is a vendor or service provider that should have access to the organization. I think that risk-based and integrated process section talks about things that are easily shown by organizations. The part where it becomes difficult or you're going to have varying degrees of success is in the other, I think, three, right? So you start to talk about make sure that you have the right controls, making sure that you have the right relationships, and making sure that you have appropriate consequences. Those are the hurdles. I think that the integrated process piece is what everyone's doing already. The next three are the ones that people have to concentrate on.
I was just saying, yeah, I'm thinking about it in light of the world events right now. And you think about as some of the problems with the pandemic is that they saw that, some of the capabilities to provide healthcare or healthcare services were 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 problematic because of the supply chain of those organizations. So you also have the HIPAA security rule, which indicates that a covered entity needs to ensure that risks associated with their various business associates are commensurate. And I think that goes right hand in hand with what the DOJ is trying to do here, but maybe just from a slightly different angle. But really trying to focus on the same things.
Well, I think that it's incumbent on any organization. Well, so we'll take healthcare, for example. We know from our own experience that healthcare just can go in 100 different directions with thousands of different partners, and some partners are domestic and some of their business partners are international. And your organizations do have some risk tied to that, but they are also responsible for having their own vendor risk management programs. And to the extent that you can know what they know and see what they've seen, and then apply that risk profile to how you're going to use that particular service provider and all of their third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties. That's a lot of information that you can glean. But again, after you've collected that information and you've reviewed that information, you still have to be able to do something with it. I think that's the challenge, or even just to be able to determine whether or not you need that third party. What's the business rationale for having them in the organization, and does that rationale does it meet the criteria for onboarding whatever amount of risk that service provider and all of their third and fourth parties represent? It can be challenging, definitely, but I think that's why those programs are in place. So the controls that are in the DOJ guidance, I think they refer to them as appropriate controls. Everything that they list in that section is some type of a business control rather than a technical one. So it talks about, I think what I said to Joe, right? What's the rationale for bringing in a particular service provider? If that service provider has a spotty record, or maybe they represent some risk, not necessarily around legality, but they represent some risk. Does the risk that they introduce to your organization justify the onboarding based on what you know about them? If it does, what can you build into the contracts that help you monitor and evaluate performance? And what can you build into your platforms and your processes where you have ongoing monitoring? So all of these controls are intended to give you an idea as real time as possible about not only how well it's performing, but any additional risks that might be heaped onto the organization by bringing them on board. Those are all business level. We could probably talk for hours about what the technical controls would be for something like that. But, here they're just talking about administrative. What's legal doing? What's procurement doing? Primarily, what's contracting doing? And what are you putting in place in those different channels to protect the organization? And, how can you proof that out to a prosecutor if they were to come in? How can you show what you're doing is effective? So I think those are probably good examples of appropriate controls, at least in the context of the guidance that was provided.
They look at, number one, everybody looks at the costs of the different products. I mean, that's number one. And what are you getting for it? I mean, are you getting information that you can actually utilize and put together? Um, you know, as Justin was saying before, they might have so much information that they can't make heads or tails out of it. And sometimes you have a situation where a particular vendor has multiple contracts with the same company. So now you have this, portion of the company is getting this service A over here, and another portion of the company is getting service B. And are you actually assessing the overall vendor correctly? I mean, if one area has a major risk, are you able to ensure that the other area is apprised of it, or that data somehow funnels together? Putting together all this information in general from a risk point of view seems to be a problem area for many companies.
Well, so this is where your appropriate controls kind of meet that management of relationships thing. If any of the guidance is difficult to implement, probably that would be, based on the examples that were provided in the guidance, that would probably be the most difficult one, because effectively, based on the guidance, if you go by what's stated in the document, what you're really doing is you're asking organizations to say, we're going to bring you on board, but we want complete access to your salary and organizational structure, incentive structure. We need to be able to look at your books and see how you're settling transactions, these types of things. That can be, that would be an interesting discussion, I think, to have. So when you talk about management of relationships, I think what you have to do is make sure you put enough protection into the contract. If you go by the guidance, just staying at the business level, you have to put enough protection in the contracts to allow you some flexibility in evaluating that third party on an ongoing basis. To the extent that they're just looking at things. Really, I think what it boils down to is conflict of interest. And as you said, making sure that nobody's paid off. There's only so much you're going to see in the books anyway. But there's other things that you can do in the management of relationships as well. You always have transactions, for example. How are you monitoring that? And then if you see, dips in performance or a failure to transact contracts appropriately, what do you have in the paperwork that allows you to go in and dig a little bit deeper and see if there's not a problem that's more systemic? And I think that's what it's getting at when it talks to prosecutors to say, well, you need to look at the organization from a vendor management perspective and make sure these things are in place. It's nice, and they should probably do that. But again, that's one of the pieces of the sort of the four tenets, I guess, that we would call them, of the DOJ guidance. That's one of the areas where it's not something that's just going to happen right away. There's a contract cycle, there's relationship cycles, and that's going to impact the ability to at least demonstrate the management of relationships in the context of what the DOJ thinks. Let's say, so I guess that was actions and consequences in the document. That's basically, once you get some bad news, what are you going to do about it, right? And how are you going to prevent the offending organization from continuing to operate in your environment? There are a lot of things that you can do with that. This is one of those areas where I would say a repository, a technical solution is probably the answer. Making sure that you have a solid system for tracking sort of that end-to-end relationship with vendors, appropriate onboarding and offboarding, and making sure that you have attributes in those systems that report up to the enterprise, not just in a silo, because you never know who has a different system somewhere on their desk, right? But reports up to the organization and says, this is a vendor that we can't use. And these are the reasons why. By the way, it's not good enough just to say, you can't use this vendor anymore. You need to be able to flag that vendor and provide context to the reasons for them not being in the organization. And just making sure that the folks who are in the business of procurement have access to that kind of information. It doesn't. We see that information quite a bit with our customers, where they've captured that type of information, the onboarding, the offboarding, and sometimes offboarding for cause. But it's amazing to us sometimes who doesn't have access to that information, right? So that's just one of those areas where, again, I think a lot of organizations, just like with the risk-based or the integrated processes, I think that tracking that type of information is done fairly regularly in industry. I don't know that industry is doing such a great job of actually doing something with it. And that's the point of the DOJ guidance, is to make sure that once you've collected this information, you can make it available to people and ensure that the organization doesn't onboard these vendors again.
Staffing is always an issue. And as much as you have individuals, whether they're internal or a third party, to go out and talk to the vendors, many firms rely on subject matter experts within the organization to review the answers that the vendors will provide them with. Now, one of the problems is those people don't always get paid to do that. So when they formulate their goals for the year, that's not on there, but it is something that takes up, an amount of time for them. They need to do it. So it becomes somewhat of a bottleneck, and something where there could be prone to check the boxes there and not have the quality of the information that they really should have.
And I think I can add to that just to expand on your comments a little bit, Joe. We know what we've seen over the past 10 years or so. Going back to Tim's original question, it used to be that organizations had to do all of this stuff themselves. And if this were to come out 10 years ago, no one would know how to address it. But these days, it's important to remember that there are a lot of organizations that do some or most of what this guidance is asking an organization to do. So at CastleHill, we perform vendor risk assessments for our clients. They're data service providers who provide the negative news and the OFAC checks and State Department. There are fantastic platforms out there that can take existing information and pull it all together and create a nice, reporting system. So I think that the resources are available. I think what it really takes is a lot of planning. It takes intent, and you really have to know, you really have to have a solid vision of where you want to go when you start the project of, implementing effectively what would support the guidance from DOJ. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of stuff that they don't want to do when they wake up in the morning, but there are a lot of organizations and companies out there that do it for them and probably a little cheaper, to tell you the truth.
Back to the real actions comment. So, when we talk about sometimes being surprised at different people not actually having access to information or things of that sort, and certainly we see that across the board, even beyond third-party risk. What is, not to be down on some of the programs, but certainly I think we've seen in some cases where a program is set up to make sure that each of these questions individually has been responded to, right? So in the guidance, for example, somebody went through and put these down as a list of items that they then went and said, yes, we do that thing, and yes, we do that thing. Whereas I think, we talked a little about the real actions and consequences. That's about looking at the forest, not just the individual trees. Is that fair characterization of what those actions or expectations are?
I think it's fair. I don't think it's complete. I think that the expectations can be much broader. In fact, if I take a look at the guidance that DOJ provided, it's obvious that they looked at it very much from a business operations, from an operational risk perspective. But there's probably 1,000 other things that they could do, or dozens of different ways that you could implement. And at the end of the day, you would have the same resource, the same pool of data available to you. So while it gives good, broad, general guidance on what prosecutors should look for and where they would look for those things in an organization, the organization itself has a lot of option available to them to accommodate, the particular requirements. Well, I think anybody can be impacted, and I don't know that it has so much to do with the size of an organization as it does their focus. So if you take a look at, historically where you have the types of issues that would land a prosecutor on your door, right? It has to do primarily with, your financial services, your manufacturing, and in some cases, a lot of your service companies that deal with things like, probably the best, a lot of your, believe it or not, think tanks, any of those organizations where they have services that are executed against sort of the C-level organizations, that type of thing. So these are all, different areas. It has more to do with what you do than it does how big you are.
I'm seeing that, organizations of, increasingly smaller size are concerned about this and are taking some actions against, to protect themselves from this. Now, the danger here is that the actions that they're taking are just a check the box kind of thing. Because they know they need to do something, and they're not going to be seen as something that is effective when the DOJ or someone else comes around to audit them.
Well, I mean, this all came about because, we all know, we've all seen what's happened over the last 10 years. Somebody makes a misstep or something hits the news of a controversial nature, and now the businesses are pointing at the vendors are pointing at their third parties are pointing back to, the origin of the service and everything. And now the prosecutors are saying, you know what, we can do that. We can work with that. And this is how you're going to help us do it. So I don't know if it matters, if you're a small, tiny, credit union or a huge conglomerate, you have the same exposure, probably not to the same degree, but, the same. It's a product of the same risk, really, is what they're going after.
Hi, everyone. We had some audio problems at the end of the podcast. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining us on Coffee Chat with CastleHill. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Justin, for the insights and information you provided. Have a great day.